Into enemy territory I go, making a quick stop in Maryland. Today, we take a look at Baltimore's Eastpoint Mall, which might not quite be dead yet, but does face some stiff challenges on the road ahead. Come along and I'll tell you what I mean. Before we begin on the history, let me remind you that this is during the Mall Walker Hour on a Sunday. Please keep this in mind before you comment about how dead and empty it is. Eastpoint Mall's story starts as far back as the 50s, with first mentions in the papers dating at 1956. While there isn't a lot of information on the mall back then, historic satellite imagery dating to 1957 showed that the mall started out as a simple strip mall, but would become an open-air mall over the course of the 60s, with Joseph Meyerhoff listed as the mall's developer. The shopping center reportedly started with a Hochschild Kahns and a Hutzler's. As shopping malls became more and more popular, Eastpoint would become enclosed in the 70s, gaining a roof and a JCPenney as a third anchor. The specific date of the mall's enclosure was reported to be 1972. Meanwhile, JCPenney would sign on officially in 1974. Competition was stiff, and over time, Hutzler's would close in the 80s, with some saying 1984 and others saying 1989. Meanwhile, Hochschild's and Kahns would close its doors in 1983. But then in 1991, we would shed some light on a major renovation that occurred. In an effort to future-proof Eastpoint Mall, the owners at the time, Shopko and Shearson Lehman Bros., would collaborate as Eastpoint Partners LP with plans to overhaul the mall into a contemporary 90s look with some 50s throwbacks. This also included plans to overhaul the mall into a multi-use facility with offices, medical professional spaces, and the addition of a Sears store. The marketing director stated that they were aiming for more of a middling blue-collar market, citing Sears as a great equalizer. Oh, we laugh at that today, but back in the 90s, Sears was still a powerhouse of a department store between Craftsman tools, school clothes for the kids, and the infamous Long Live Paint incident as told by Jim Brewer. The old Hutzler's space would get gutted and then overhauled to make way for the offices, as well as a food court. As you'll see in a moment, this is the one portion where the mall briefly becomes a 3-floor mall. While this portion remains, the mall itself is still largely single-floor. With Hutzler's taken care of, Hochschild Kahn's vacant building would be subletted to make way for Value City, whom offered both a standard Value City store and a Value City furniture gallery. To differentiate between the two, we'll refer to Value City as Value City Prime. The last addition to the mall was an Ames discount store. And we all know what happened to Ames. After failing to vor and digest Hills, it went belly up. Whether or not it made it to 2002 is unknown, and that's besides the point. Attempts were made to fill in the mall's anchors as stores closed at least, with Ames getting filled in by a Steve & Barry's. But when Steve & Barry's closed in 2008, Designer Shoe Warehouse would fill in the space briefly before getting replaced by Shoppers World in 2010. Meanwhile, Value City Prime would close shop, but Value City Furniture would live on as of the making of this video. The vacancy left behind by Value City Prime would end up getting filled in by Burlington Coat Factory. However, the next problem would arise with the mall: ownership juggling. I don't have the full timeline of ownership changes, but I have a few transactions over the 2000s. Thor Equities would acquire the mall in 2006. Then the mall would go into receivership in 2012. And in 2014, the mall was purchased by MCB Real Estate, whom is listed as the current management as of the making of this video. The mall unfortunately lost 2 anchors over the 2010s, with Shoppers World, of all tenants, closing in 2016. I guess the shoppers saw the end of the world. Meanwhile, Sears, surprise surprise, was seared in 2018. Despite this, however, the mall actually held out, maintaining decent occupancy over the years. Even the food court isn't doing too badly, even in a post-CCP virus world. However, there is one major event that might lead to a slow decline of this mall, as we'll get into in just a moment. Let's stir that pot. In March 2019, a massive fight broke out at the Eastpoint Mall among teenagers. It was reported that teens had gathered for a March Madness party, and after a dispute happened in the parking lot, it escalated into a fight and quickly became a brawl between 300 teens. Security and police were called in to disperse the fight, and arrests were made on several participants citing second-degree assault, robbery, and destruction of property. And you wonder why teenagers don't get nice things anymore. This fight wound up leading to a county-wide movement for various malls and police precincts to try and beef up patrols and security, as well as youth escort policies to prevent these brawls from happening in the future. And then 2020 happened, so we're 0 for 2 on that front. Thanks a lot. How will this affect the Eastpoint Mall going forward? Well, there is a high chance that this will hurt the mall's perceptions, leading people to believe it is an unsafe place to be. Although, here I am by myself walking around. Another factor to consider is that parents might not come to the mall as they don't want to have to keep their teenager on a leash. Nonetheless, with all this in mind, we can only wait and see how the Eastpoint Mall handles itself going forward. Overall, not too bad a run for a 60 going on to 70-year-old mall. Wouldn't you think so? Whew, that was a lot to get out. Now, what do I think personally about the Eastpoint Mall? Well, it's about as 90s as it gets, with its overall aesthetic and design. Although that main corridor between Burlington and the food court is pretty neat, which did hint to me that this mall might be a bit older than one might think. Seriously, most other companies would do away with those columns and try to cram double the kiosks in all that space. Some would go further to either carpet the whole thing or bleach the mall to hell and back. But for what it is, I can appreciate it. It can also be a little quirky too, between those long corridors branching off from the main one and the 2 floors above and below the food court. Now, one thing I did notice while I was at the mall is the basement floor below the food court seems to have an arcade and activity center, which you'll see in a few moments. So parents might be able to let their kids hang out and play down there. So a youth escort policy might not be all that bad after all. That, I didn't really feel unsafe at this mall. In fact, I was kind of just having a good time, walking around, getting what I needed. There were a couple mall walkers I was politely avoiding, as well as a group of older guys in the food court chatting it up. But overall, this mall still has a pleasant atmosphere despite what it may have happened outside in 2019. Now, this brings us to the elephant in the room. This mall is struggling. Sears is empty, the old Ames pad is empty, and the corridor leading to the old Ames is a bit dead as well. The rest of the mall, however, still has a fair amount of life to it. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. What are we going to do with the empty Sears and the empty Ames pad? Those spaces can't keep sitting vacant, and in this day and age, trying to fill them back in with more retail is just not very viable anymore. So what do we do? I'll let you, the viewer, decide on that front. Have a look around Dundalk suburb and see what it could use. And on that note, we are getting ready to wind down for the Eastpoint Mall. What did you think about this place? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you believe this 60-year-old mall still has a place? Or should it be redeveloped into something else entirely? Share in the comments down below. Also, and by the way, if you have any issues with the channel or this video in question, I ask, be a little more constructive with your feedback, rather than just calling me names like a petulant child or a Twitterati. Not that I'm gonna mention any names, not yet at least. Just keep that in mind when you go down there. Thanks for having me, Dundalk, Maryland. And until next time, this is Doomie Grunt wishing you and the Eastpoint Mall farewell and good luck in the raging storm.